The summer sun hung low over Coyote Ridge, Texas, 1884, when a dusty stagecoach stopped by the lonely windmill at the edge of town. From it stepped a young woman named Eleanor Price, a mail-order bride with trembling hands and fears still living behind her eyes. She'd left behind a past she couldn't bear to name, clutching one worn suitcase and a letter that promised safety, if not love. Waiting for her was Caleb Warren, a broad-shouldered cowboy with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. His first words, low and drawling, made her breath hitch. "Darlin, I don't bite unless you ask." Was he teasing her, testing her, or was it his way of hiding his own wounds beneath the humor of a man who'd seen too much war and too little kindness? If you were Eleanor alone, frightened, and miles from everything you've ever known, would you trust a stranger's gentle eyes? Would you believe that somewhere in the wild heart of Texas, love might still be possible? Stay with us. Friends, like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, and let's step into a story where fear meets grace on the edge of the frontier. The summer of 1884 came heavy and golden over the wide plains of Willow Creek, Wyoming. The grass had burned pale under the sun, and the horizon seemed endless, the kind of emptiness that made a person wonder if God had ever meant this land for people at all. From the noon stagecoach stepped a young woman, her boots sinking slightly into the red dust of the station yard. Her name was Clara Jennings, and the first thing anyone might have noticed about her was not her beauty, though she had that quiet, refined kind born of restraint, but the fear that lived behind her pale gray eyes. She carried one small valise, the kind that held more memory than fabric. Inside were a folded dress, a Bible with her mother's initials pressed into the leather, and a locket that had been kissed so many times the silver had worn smooth. She held it close against her chest as if it could speak courage into her heart. The letter she'd received 6 months earlier from a rancher named Elias Boone had been kind, steady in tone, without poetry, but full of sincerity. He'd written, "I'm not looking for beauty or charm. I'm looking for someone who wants peace. There's plenty of room here for that. Peace." Clara had written back that she'd be honored to come. What she hadn't written, what she never told anyone, was that she had nowhere else to go. The coachman tipped his hat, muttering something about the heat, and climbed back aboard. The horses snorted, the wheels turned, and then Clara was alone in the middle of nowhere, dust swirling around her skirts like ghosts. That was when she saw him. Elias Boone stood by the hitching post, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing a face cut by wind and time. His eyes were a clear, river-water blue, calm but cautious. A small scar ran along his chin, the kind of mark a man earns quietly and never explains. He didn't rush toward her. Instead, he nodded once, removed his hat, and said in a low voice that carried more gravel than melody, "Miss Jennings, I reckon you've had a long ride. I'm Elias Boone." His tone was courteous, even gentle. But before Clara could reply, he smiled just a corner of his mouth and said, "Darlin, I don't bite unless you ask." The words hit her like the crack of thunder over dry land. For a heartbeat, her chest went cold. She didn't understand. Was he teasing, mocking, testing how easily she'd break? She wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of silence. But something in his eyes, a flicker of kindness, maybe regret, stopped her. The line, meant to be light-hearted, carried an awkward sincerity, the kind that belongs to a man who'd forgotten how to talk softly. Clara drew a slow breath and said the only thing she could. It was a long ride. Mr. Boone. He nodded again, like he understood far more than she'd said. They walked together toward a wagon hitched nearby. 2 mules stood restless under the sun, and a young border collie circled their feet, tail wagging. Elias loaded her small valise into the back. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the way men work who've learned patience from solitude. The road home was long, a winding dirt track that cut through sagebrush and golden grass. For miles, they said nothing. Clara watched the distant hills, the shimmering heat, the way the light made even the rocks seem alive. Elias's presence beside her felt solid, quiet, not comforting exactly, but steady, like the sound of a clock in an empty room. After a while, he said, "You don't owe me anything. Miss Jennings, you come here for peace. That's all right by me. You'll have your own room. You can lock it if you like." It was the strangest kindness she'd ever been offered freedom. No expectations, no demands. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought she might cry. Instead, she looked down at her hands and whispered, "Thank you." The Boone homestead came into view just as the sun began to fall behind the hills, a small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, a barn half finished, a windmill creaking lazily in the distance. The air smelled of pine, leather, and something baking. Elias climbed down, offered his hand to help her. She hesitated, then took it. His palm was rough, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. Inside, the cabin was simple: 2 wooden chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. A small bunch of wildflowers sat in a chipped vase on the table. She wondered who had put them there. "This is home," he said quietly. "Or it can be." For the first time that day, Clara felt a flicker of warmth beneath the fear. It wasn't trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. That night, as the sky deepened to indigo and the coyotes began their lonely songs, Clara sat by the small window of her room, looking out at the prairie. The air was still, except for the occasional creak of the house settling. She unpacked her few belongings, set her mother's locket by the lamp, and whispered a prayer that sounded more like a plea than faith. Down the hall, she heard Elias moving boots on wood, the faint clatter of dishes. Then a knock on her door, soft as a heartbeat. "I brought you some water," he said, "and a blanket. Nights get cold out here." When she opened the door, he didn't look directly at her, just set the things down and tipped his hat again. Then, before she could speak, he added, almost shyly, "Sleep easy, Miss Jennings. You're safe here." He turned and walked away. Clara stood there for a long time, her fingers trembling on the doorknob. The word safe felt strange in her mouth, foreign, like a song she hadn't sung in years, and for the first time since leaving Missouri, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could learn it again. Outside. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain. The night was wide and silent, the kind that held both loneliness and promise. Clara lay down on the narrow bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. Somewhere, a wolf called out across the hills, and she thought of how easily the sound of sorrow could turn into something like hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that this man, this land, and this fragile chance at peace might be the beginning of something she hadn't dared to dream a life built not on fear, but on gentleness. and as the lamp flickered out, the darkness didn't feel so cruel anymore. Morning in Willow Creek came softly, a thin veil of light spilling across the valley, touching the tops of the cottonwoods, glinting on the small pond beyond the barn. For Clara Jennings, that first sunrise on the Boone Ranch felt like a moment caught between worlds, the one she'd left behind, and the uncertain one she'd stepped into. The sounds of the prairie woke before she did the creak of the windmill, the low rumble of cattle, the sharp cry of a hawk somewhere above. She sat up slowly, still in the borrowed nightgown Elias had left folded on the trunk. Her hands brushed the thin quilt. It smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. The quiet was almost too deep, like standing in a church after the last hymn. She hadn't expected to sleep, yet somehow she had. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the strange steadiness of this place, a steadiness that seemed to come from the man who owned it. When Clara stepped outside, the air was cool and clean. Mist curled low over the grass, and the world felt washed new. She spotted him by the corral, a silhouette against the rising sun, Elias Boone, the man who'd written those plain, careful letters, and the man who'd met her yesterday with a line she still couldn't quite understand. He was lifting a saddle onto a horse, his movements sure and slow. The old scar along his chin caught the light, pale against his sun-browned skin. He looked older in the daylight, not in years, but in the weight he carried. A man carved by hard seasons, not bitterness. Clara hesitated, unsure whether to speak or wait. Then he turned and their eyes met for the first time without the haze of travel or fear between them. "Mornin'," he said, his voice low and rough, but not unkind. "Good mornin'," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded toward the porch. "Coffee's on the stove. Hope you don't mind it strong. That's how I know it's working." Something about the simplicity of his words, the quiet humor tucked beneath them, loosened the knot in her chest. She gave the smallest smile. "I've had worse." Elias's eyes warmed, just a flicker. "Then you'll do fine here." They shared breakfast at the small kitchen table, bread, dried meat, and strong coffee that could have stripped paint. Neither spoke much. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just how the land spoke in pauses, in small gestures, in what wasn't said. After a time, Elias cleared his throat. "Figured I'd show you around. If you're staying a while, you ought to know where things are. If you're staying a while." The words landed gently, but they carried something deeper, a kind of respect she hadn't expected. He wasn't assuming she'd stay. He was giving her a choice. Clara followed him out to the yard. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage. The Boone Ranch wasn't much a few fenced acres, a half-built barn, a chicken coop leaning slightly to one side, but the land stretched wide and wild around it, like a promise not yet broken. Elias showed her the well, the smokehouse, and the small garden patch behind the cabin. "I planted beans last spring," he said. "They didn't take. Soil's too dry. Maybe, or maybe I didn't." She glanced at him. Didn't what? He met her eyes with that same quiet honesty. Didn't believe they'd grow. The simplicity of his answer and the vulnerability in it struck her deeper than any grand confession. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Maybe they need another try. He gave a small smile, more real this time. Maybe we both do. As the morning wore on, Clara found herself noticing things she hadn't before: the way he moved, deliberate and sure, the way he spoke to his horse as if it understood, the careful distance he kept, as though afraid to startle her, It wasn't indifference. It was restraint, the mark of a man who'd known what it meant to hurt someone without meaning to. When he handed her a bucket to fill from the well, their hands brushed. The contact was brief but sent a small shock through her. Not fear, but awareness. She looked up and found him watching her, a faint trace of apology in his eyes. "Didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't," she said quickly and realized it was true. The rest of the day passed quietly. She helped gather kindling, fetched water, and fed the chickens, each small task grounding her in a way words couldn't. By late afternoon, she found herself humming softly an old hymn her mother used to sing while sewing. She stopped when she noticed Elias listening from the doorway. "Sorry," she murmured. He shook his head. "Don't be. Haven't heard a voice in this house in near 3 years." That confession hung between them heavy, intimate, and strangely tender. 3 years. She wondered what loneliness had looked like for him, whether it sat with him at breakfast or rode with him through the hills. She thought of her own loneliness, long and sharp as winter wind, and realized how similar they might be, though neither dared to name it yet. As the sun dipped low, painting the plains in gold and violet, Elias led his horse to the stable and turned back toward her. "You'll be all right here. Miss Jennings," he said, "you don't have to fear me." Something in her chest shifted that word again. Fear. She wanted to tell him that fear wasn't about him. It lived in her bones, carried from another place, another fire. But instead, she nodded. "I know." He studied her a moment longer, then tipped his hat. "Good. Then we'll get along just fine." When he walked away, the evening light followed him, stretching long shadows across the ground. Clara stood by the porch rail, watching him until he disappeared behind the barn. Her heart was quiet, but her thoughts weren't. She remembered his clumsy joke from yesterday, "I don't bite, unless you ask." And now, somehow, it no longer sounded cruel or mocking. It sounded like what it truly was, the awkward humor of a lonely man trying to bridge a distance neither of them had asked for. That night, as the crickets sang and the lantern's glow trembled against the walls, Clara wrote her first words in a small notebook she'd found at the bottom of her valise. "He is not what I feared. Perhaps no one ever is. Once you truly see them. Hope is a fragile thing on the frontier. It comes slow, like spring thaw after a hard winter, and if you're not careful, it can vanish before you dare to touch it." For Clara Jennings. Hope began the morning she first stepped inside the rhythm of Elias Boone's world. Days passed with the kind of stillness only wide land can hold. The prairie moved at its own pace, wind through sage, the steady turn of the windmill, the soft thud of boots on dry earth. There was no rush here, no city noise to drown thought, no polite distractions, just space open and honest, and a man who seemed to fit inside it like he'd been carved by it. Elias never spoke more than he needed to, but what he did say, he meant. That was something Clara had almost forgotten existed, words that stayed true after they were spoken. One morning, she followed him to the barn. He didn't invite her, nor did he send her away. The air inside smelled of hay, horses, and old timber, the scent of labor, not loneliness. Sunlight slanted through the boards, lighting up the dust that danced in the air. Elias was brushing down his mare, a big chestnut with kind eyes and a scar on her flank. He glanced over his shoulder and said, "Her name's Ruby. Found her half-starved near the river 2 winters back. Took her a long while to trust anyone again." Clara stepped closer. slowly. "She's beautiful. She is now," he replied softly, and for a moment she wasn't sure if he was still talking about the horse. Ruby flicked her tail, curious but calm. Clara reached out, hesitated, then laid her hand against the mare's warm neck. The animal shivered once, then stilled. That simple act, the quiet exchange between fear and acceptance, filled the barn like a small prayer. Elias watched, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess she knows good hearts when she sees one." Clara flushed, unsure how to answer. Compliments were rare in her life, rarer still when they were meant in kindness, not charm. She busied herself with the hay, pretending not to notice the warmth rising in her chest. As the days unfolded, Elias showed her his world in the only way he knew how, through doing. He taught her how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the air smelled, how to tell a good rope from a bad one, and which plants near the creek could heal a burn. He never raised his voice, never told her what to do. He simply worked steady, consistent, and somehow that steadiness made room for her to breathe. One evening, while the sun was dropping low and gold light spilled over the fields, Elias paused by the porch rail where Clara sat sewing a torn sleeve. He leaned against the post, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "You don't owe me anything, Clara," he said, his voice as gentle as the wind moving through the cottonwoods. "Not for being here, not for helping. If you ever feel like leaving, you just say so. You can lock your door every night if it helps you rest. No one will question it." Clara's hands froze mid-stitch. The needle trembled. She looked up at him at that scar, those worn blue eyes that never asked too much. "I don't." She started, then stopped. "I don't understand. Why would you say that?" He looked out across the plains, the horizon glowing like the edge of heaven. "Because peace don't come easy for some folks," he said quietly, "and sometimes the kindest thing a man can do is not take what isn't freely given." For a long time, Clara couldn't speak. She'd been bartered once, not for love, not for choice, but survival. No one had ever told her she could keep something of herself, let alone her peace. "I haven't felt safe in a long time," she admitted, her voice breaking on the last word. Elias nodded, slow, understanding. "Then we'll start there." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of trust beginning, of fear loosening its hold, of something unnamed but real. Later that night, she stood by her window, watching him outside near the barn. He was fixing a fence by lantern light, the glow flickering against his shoulders. He worked with the patience of someone who knew how to mend more than wood and wire. In that moment, she realized Elias Boone wasn't just showing her his world. He was quietly inviting her to build her own within it. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn. She found coffee already warming on the stove, a small note by her cup written in careful, deliberate script. "Weather looks fair today. If you'd like, we'll ride to the ridge after chores. There's a view worth seeing." She traced the words with her fingertip, not for their meaning, but for the care inside them. Someone had thought of her, not as a duty, not as a possession, but as a person worth sharing a sunrise with. When they rode out later that day, the air smelled of wildflowers and dust. The land opened wide before them, hills rolling toward the horizon, scattered with cattle and the glitter of a far-off creek. Elias stopped his horse at the crest of a hill. "This is it," he said. "All I've got. Not much. Maybe. But it's home." Clara looked around the endless sky, the gentle hum of insects, the breath of wind across her face, and felt something shift inside her. Home wasn't walls or furniture. It was the feeling of standing beside someone who made the world feel less empty. When she turned to thank him, he was already watching her. For a moment, they said nothing. The silence was enough. That evening, when they returned to the cabin, Elias built a fire in the stove and quietly set a small plate of food outside her door. He didn't knock, didn't ask to come in, just left it there, the way a man might leave a gift he hoped would be accepted without words. Clara waited until his footsteps faded before opening the door. Steam curled from the bowl stew, simple but fragrant. A folded napkin lay beside it, and, under it, another note. Eat while it's warm. Tomorrow, we'll mend the fence together. She held that slip of paper for a long while, her eyes stinging. Maybe trust didn't arrive all at once. Maybe it came in small things: a bowl of stew, a space to breathe, a door you were allowed to lock if you needed to. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and hope. Inside, Clara sat by the fire, holding the note against her heart. For the first time since leaving Missouri, she didn't feel like a stranger to her own life. Night fell early in Willow Creek that evening, the kind of dark that seemed to rise from the earth instead of falling from the sky. The prairie stretched out in silence, and the cabin stood like a small flicker of life against an endless wilderness. Clara Jennings sat by the small fire in her room, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The day had been long, full of small kindnesses, unspoken gestures, and a steady rhythm she wasn't used to. Yet, when the quiet settled in, fear found its way back, soft as breath but sharp as memory. Back in Missouri, nights had been when the world turned cruel, when doors meant nothing, when men who smiled by day turned into something else entirely by dark. She'd promised herself she'd never be caught unguarded again. On the table beside her was a small bottle of ink, one she'd found earlier while unpacking her things. It had belonged to her mother, used for letters, for prayers, for the small art of believing words could still save something. But tonight, it sat within reach like a weapon. If someone tried the door, she told herself, she'd use it. She didn't know how, but she would. Through the thin wall, she could hear Elias Boone moving about the scrape of boots on the floorboards, the soft clang of metal. Then quiet. Clara rose, paced once across the room, and checked the door latch again. She'd locked it hours ago, but her fingers tested it anyway, as if assurance could be found in the click of wood and metal. Outside, the wind moaned low, brushing against the window like something alive. The house settled old timbers sighing in the cold. Every sound carried weight. Then came the noise that froze her in place, the slow turn of the door handle. Her heart leapt to her throat. The ink bottle clattered slightly as she gripped it tight, her pulse drumming in her ears. Miss Jennings. The voice was quiet, steady, familiar. Elias. He didn't push the door, didn't rattle the latch, just stood there, waiting. "I brought you some water," he said after a moment, his tone even, as though speaking to a frightened animal, "and an extra blanket. Nights turn colder than they look out here." Clara's fingers tightened around the bottle, then loosened. Her breath trembled in her chest. She didn't answer at first, couldn't. "I'll just leave it by the door," he said softly. "You don't have to open it. Just don't go thirsty." "All right," There was a pause long enough for her to imagine him standing there, holding kindness in calloused hands, unsure what to do with it. Then his footsteps faded, slow and steady across the floor. Clara waited until she was sure he'd gone before she cracked the door open an inch. The lantern in the hallway still burned low. On the floor sat a folded wool blanket and a tin cup filled to the brim with clean water. No note, no expectation, just care. She sank to her knees right there, the sight blurring through her tears. She hadn't cried in a long time, not since the night she lost everything she'd known. But something about this small, wordless gesture, the restraint, the respect reached into a place she'd thought long sealed. She pressed her hand against her mouth to muffle the sound, and in that quiet space between fear and relief, she wept. Later, wrapped in the new blanket. Clara lay awake listening to the rhythm of the wind outside. The house creaked, the fire whispered, and from somewhere near the barn came the faint nickering of a horse. She imagined Elias there, checking the gates one last time before turning in, his lantern swinging in the dark. It struck her then how easily he could have crossed her boundaries, how often men did without thinking. But he hadn't. He'd stood on the other side of the door and chosen restraint, chosen decency. In a world where mercy was rare, that choice felt holy. Sleep came slowly, in fragments, when she dreamed. It wasn't of Missouri, or the smoke and screams she'd run from, but of the sound of Elias Boone's voice low. Careful, certain you don't owe me anything. By morning, and the sky outside her window was pale and wide, brushed with rose and silver. Clara sat up and saw the water still half full beside her bed. She smiled faintly. She'd drink the rest later after she found the words to thank him. When she opened her door, she found the cabin already awake. The smell of coffee and wood smoke filled the air. Elias was by the stove, sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from washing. He looked up when she entered, but didn't speak right away. "Mornin'," he said finally, with that small nod of his. "Good mornin'," she answered. Her voice was quiet, but steady. He gestured toward the table. "Didn't know if you'd be up yet. There's biscuits. Not much, but they're warm." Clara sat across from him. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was something different now, something fragile and full of meaning. She wanted to tell him thank you, for the water, for the blanket, for not being what she feared. But when she opened her mouth, all that came out was, "It's a fine morning." He smiled a little. "It is." They ate in quiet harmony, the sound of forks and the ticking clock filling the space. After breakfast, Elias stood and reached for his hat. "I'll be out with the horses. Fence still needs mending." She hesitated, then said softly, "Mr. Boone." He turned, waiting. "Thank you. For last night." His eyes softened, but he didn't move closer. "You're welcome, Miss Jennings. You rest easy now." And with that, he was gone out into the sunlight, into the rhythm of his work, leaving behind a warmth that lingered long after the door closed. Clara watched him from the window, the figure of a man both near and far, a man who understood the strength it took not to take. Something in her chest eased, like a wound learning how to breathe again. That night, she would write in her journal, "He stood at my door, and for the first time in years, no one came through." Maybe safety isn't the absence of fear. Maybe it's the presence of someone who honors it. Morning in Willow Creek broke soft and pale, the kind of light that carried no sharpness, only calm. A thin mist drifted over the pasture, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. When Clara Jennings opened her eyes, she could smell coffee, real coffee, strong and dark. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The rough-hewn walls of the cabin glowed faintly in the morning light, the fire in the stove still whispering low. She sat up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and saw something she hadn't expected, a plate on the small table near the window. 2 biscuits, a slice of bacon, and a jar of blackberry jam, still warm. For a long time, she just stared at it, unsure what to do. Then she smiled, not out of joy exactly, but because this simple act felt like something she hadn't known in years being thought of. Through the window, she saw Elias Boone already out in the fields, a solitary figure moving through the mist. He worked with quiet precision, mending the corral fence, checking the cattle, pausing every so often to glance toward the sky like a man who still remembered to thank it. There was no call for her to come out, no command, no impatience, just the rhythm of his labor, steady and sure, as if the land itself trusted him. She ate slowly, tasting the still warm jam, and felt a peculiar peace settle in her chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something gentler, quieter. Later, she carried the empty plate to the sink and washed it carefully. Though there was hardly a speck on it, it felt wrong to leave a kindness unanswered, even a small one, that afternoon, while sweeping the porch. Clara noticed something by the edge of the fence, a patch of white blooms half hidden in the grass. She set down the broom and knelt. Daisies, wild, simple, beautiful, her mother's favorite. For a moment, her throat tightened. She hadn't seen daisies since Missouri, since the last spring before the fire. She reached out, touching one of the petals lightly. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of earth and sun-dried hay. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. Behind her, Elias's footsteps sounded on the porch. She turned, startled, but his expression was easy. "Didn't mean to sneak up," he said. "You found them?" She nodded. They're lovely." "Did you plant them?" He shook his head. "No. Guess they came up on their own. This land's got its own memory." His words lingered between them. "This land's got its own memory." Clara looked back at the flowers, their petals trembling in the breeze. Maybe that was true of people too, that even after the fire and the running and the fear, something good could still push its way up through the ashes. Elias crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "My ma liked daisies too," he said quietly. "Used to say they were a proof that beauty don't ask permission. It just grows where it's able." Clara smiled faintly. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he said, tougher than she looked. "Gentle, though. Real gentle." They fell into silence again. Not awkward, just full the kind that holds understanding without needing to name it. As days passed, that same quiet rhythm continued. Elias worked the land. Clara tended the house. They spoke little, but every exchange seemed to mean more for its rarity. Sometimes he'd leave fresh wood stacked by the stove before she woke. Sometimes she'd mend the sleeve of his work shirt and fold it neatly by his door. These were small things, gestures that asked for nothing, offered everything. Each evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky blazed orange and violet, they'd share supper at the same small table. Elias would talk about the cattle or the weather, about a new well he hoped to dig before autumn. Clara would listen, adding a word here and there. But what she didn't say mattered just as much that she'd begun to look forward to those quiet suppers, to the sound of his voice, to the simple comfort of being seen without being asked for anything in return. One evening, as the air turned cooler, Elias brought in a pot of stew. He set it on the table and cleared his throat, almost shy. "I've been thinking," he said, "might build you a garden patch near the porch. Soil's better there. Sun hits it just right." Clara blinked, surprised. "A garden figure you might want one. Folks ought to grow something of their own. Helps the heart." Her eyes softened. That would mean a lot. He nodded once. "Then we'll start tomorrow." And they did. The next morning, they turned the soil together. Elias worked with the steady patience of a man who didn't rush what mattered. Clara knelt beside him, her hands dirty, her hair coming loose in the wind, and for the first time, she laughed. It wasn't loud, not even certain, but it was real. Elias looked up, startled by the sound. Then his face broke into the faintest smile. "Well," he said, "reckon that's worth the blisters." By the time the sun set, the first row was planted beans, herbs, and a small patch she saved for daisies. That night, when she wrote in her journal, her hand moved slower, more deliberate than usual. "There's a steadiness here," she wrote, "not the kind that cages you, but the kind that keeps you from falling. Maybe this is what healing sounds like, not loud, not sudden, but quiet as two people working side by side." As she blew out the lamp, she caught sight of the new garden through the window, a patch of dark earth under a silver moon. It looked like a promise waiting to bloom. The days in Willow Creek had begun to take on a rhythm, the soft kind that hums beneath life when two souls have learned to move in quiet company. Clara Jennings had come to know the sound of the place, the creak of the windmill, the low sigh of the stove at night, the steady tread of Elias Boone's boots as he crossed the yard each morning. It was a life made of small things, the mending of fences, the tending of seedlings, the quiet murmur of grace before supper. She had not realized how much peace could be found in the ordinary, until one afternoon that peace cracked open. It was late August, and the sky had that heavy look that came before rain. Elias was out near the barn, trying to secure the roof before the storm rolled in. Clara stood by the window, watching the wind chase dust across the yard. She meant to call him in, to tell him the clouds looked angry, but before she could, she heard a sharp sound, wood splitting, then a muffled cry. Her heart jumped. She ran outside, skirts gathering dust and wind. Elias lay by the fence post, one hand gripping his arm. Blood seeped through the fabric of his sleeve. Dark and sudden. "Mr. Boone," she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. "It's not bad," he said through gritted teeth. "Nail slipped. My fault." Clara pressed a torn strip of her apron against the wound, her fingers trembling. "You need to sit, please." He hesitated, then let her guide him back to the porch. The wind howled around them, carrying the smell of rain. She fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth, her movements quick but careful. When she returned, Elias sat still, jaw tight. "You don't have to fuss," he murmured. "Hush," she said softly. "You've done enough bleeding for one day." Her tone surprised them both. It carried no fear, only care quiet. Firm, certain. She washed the wound gently, her fingers brushing the roughness of his skin. Beneath her touch, he flinched once, but didn't pull away. "You've been through worse," she said, half to herself. He gave a dry laugh. You could say that. When she looked up, his eyes had gone far away, the kind of far that meant years, not miles. She wrung out the cloth, waiting, saying nothing. Sometimes silence was the only way to ask a man to speak. After a moment, he said quietly, "I fought in the war. Scout with the Union cavalry. I was 21 and thought I understood what it meant to be right." His voice carried no pride, only weariness. "I was part of a unit sent south after a raid." He continued. "We were ordered to burn a church, said it was hiding runaways. But there were folks inside, children, a preacher, a few women. I told my captain I wouldn't do it. Didn't seem like war anymore, just murder." The rain began to fall then, soft and steady. Clara didn't move. "They called me a traitor," Elias said. "Beat me near dead, left me tied to a fence post till another patrol found me. By the time they did, the church was gone, everyone inside with it." He paused, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the rain. "I still hear it sometimes, the sound of the fire, the way wood screams when it burns." Clara felt the words settle in her chest like stones. She wanted to reach for him, but her hands stayed folded in her lap. Some griefs couldn't be touched, they could only be shared by sitting near them. When he finally looked at her, there was no self-pity in his face, only honesty. "I don't tell that to most folks. They hear coward or fool, but I figure if a man doesn't draw his line somewhere, he'll lose himself piece by piece." Clara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "You didn't lose yourself," she said quietly. "You just paid the price for keeping it," for the first time since she'd known him. He looked uncertain, as though no one had ever said such words to him before. He nodded, almost shyly. "You patch up people better than you think." "Miss Jennings?" She smiled, faintly. "Only the ones who sit still long enough." The rain deepened, drumming against the roof. Inside, the fire crackled, warm and alive. Clara finished bandaging his arm, her hands steady now. She noticed the small tremor in his fingers as he tried to roll down his sleeve. And, without thinking, she did it for him, careful, deliberate, like the act itself was sacred. "Thank you," he murmured. She stood, gathering the basin. "Rest, Mr. Boone. The fence can wait." He leaned back in the chair, exhaustion lining his face. "You sound like my mother," he said, half smiling. Then she must have been right often. She replied. The corners of his mouth softened, but he said no more. For the rest of that storm, Clara sat near the window, mending a tear in his coat. Elias dozed lightly by the hearth, his breathing slow and even. Every so often, she'd glance up from her stitching and watch the firelight play across his face. The scar along his chin, the lines at his eyes, all of it spoke of a life lived hard, but not without grace. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. Inside, peace held steady. When Elias stirred, he found the coat folded neatly beside him, the stitches small and precise. Clara was asleep in the chair, her head resting against the wall, her hair loose over her shoulder. He watched her for a long moment, the way the light caught her face, the way her hands still held the needle and thread, even in sleep. Then, quietly, he stood and laid his blanket across her knees. "Thank you," he whispered, though she couldn't hear, and for the first time in years, he felt something like forgiveness, not from heaven, not from the past, but from the living warmth of another soul who'd known loss and still chosen gentleness. When the rain finally stopped, Willow Creek woke to a world washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Puddles glimmered like mirrors across the yard. The storm had left behind a hush, the kind that settles over a place after something hard has passed. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Elias Boone stirred first, feeling the stiffness in his shoulder where the nail had torn through. The bandage held firm Clara's doing. He glanced toward her chair, half expecting to see her still sleeping, but it was empty. Outside, he could hear her humming softly, the rhythm slow and tender. He rose carefully, stepping to the door. Through the open frame, he saw her kneeling in the garden, gathering branches blown down by the storm. Her skirts were damp at the hem, her hair undone, and there was something unguarded about her as if the rain had rinsed away what fear still clung to her edges. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "You'll catch a chill out there," he said gently. She looked up, shading her eyes from the sun. "Then I suppose you'd have to save me again," she teased lightly, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised them both. Elias smiled. Small, but true. "I reckon I'd try." That was how it was between them now, a careful dance of small steps, a language built out of glances and silences, each gesture saying what words could not. Later that morning, Clara found his torn shirt folded by the hearth. The fabric was frayed where the blood had dried, the sleeve ripped halfway down. She picked it up, feeling the coarse weave beneath her fingers, the roughness of a man's life lived by his own hands. She sat at the table, needle and thread ready. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and sage. She began to sew slowly, her stitches even and sure, each one like a heartbeat steadying itself after a long silence. She wasn't just mending a shirt. She knew that. This was something else, something wordless and holy. The thread moved through fabric, through pain, through the fragile bridge that now connected their two lives. Every pull of the needle felt like breathing, patient, deliberate, alive. From the doorway, Elias watched her for a while, unseen. There was something humbling about the sight this woman, quiet and strong, tending to what he had broken. He remembered all the years he'd spent thinking no one would ever touch his wounds again. Not the visible ones, not the kind that hid beneath his ribs. And yet, here she was, mending a piece of him as if it were the simplest, most natural thing in the world. He cleared his throat gently. "You don't have to do that. You know." Clara didn't look up. "I know," she said softly. "That's why it matters." The simplicity of her reply cut deeper than any sermon. He stepped closer, watching her hands move careful, graceful, sure. "My mother used to sew like that," he said after a moment. "Said a good stitch is like a good word. Holds what's worth keeping together." Clara smiled faintly. She was right. They fell silent again. The cabin felt warm, alive with the quiet rhythm of their breathing, the crackle of the fire, the soft whisper of thread through cloth. When she finished, she held the shirt up to the light. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of tiny, perfect stitches. Not invisible, no. She hadn't hidden the scar. She'd made it whole without erasing what had been torn. "There," she said, setting it on the chair beside him. "Good as new, almost." Elias reached for it, turning it in his hands. "Better, I'd say." She met his eyes then, really met them, and for a heartbeat, the world outside seemed to pause. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "Don't thank me for sewing, Mr. Boone. It's just something I could do. He gave her that small, wry smile she'd come to recognize. Sometimes the smallest things are the hardest to give. Something in her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the gentle ache of being seen. That afternoon, they worked together again side by side in the sunlight, repairing the fence the storm had torn down. Every so often their hands brushed, and each time neither pulled away as quickly as before. When the work was done, Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her on the porch. The land stretched before them, vast and gold under the lowering sun. He spoke quietly. "You ever wonder why folks like us end up in places like this?" Clara thought for a moment. "Because we're running," she said. "But maybe, somewhere along the way, we stop running and just arrive." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what this is, then, arriving." They sat in silence after that, listening to the wind weave through the grass, to the distant murmur of the creek. When the light began to fade, Clara stood and picked up the shirt she'd mended. "You should wear it tomorrow," she said. Elias took it from her, holding it carefully, almost reverently. "Feels different now," he murmured, "lighter somehow." Clara smiled, her voice soft. "Maybe because it's not carrying all the hurt anymore." He looked at her then, long and steady, as if realizing that healing didn't always come from forgetting, but from the grace of being understood. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Clara sat by the window with her journal. She opened to a fresh page and wrote, "There's a kind of silence that isn't empty. It's the space where 2 broken lives begin to listen to each other breathe. Today, I stitched a sleeve, but maybe, in some quiet way, I stitched something bigger back together, too." She closed the book, set it aside, and let the quiet fill the room. Outside, the moon rose over the plains, silver and still. Inside, the air held warmth not just from the fire, but from something unspoken that had begun to take root between them. The summer sun in Willow Creek had turned harsher by September, pressing down on the land with the weight of dust and heat. The prairie grass had gone brittle, the color of old wheat, and even the wind carried the dry scent of endings. Clara Jennings hadn't planned to go into town that day, but they were low on flour, and Elias Boone had been out mending the far pasture fence since dawn. He'd left her the wagon and the mules, saying, "You'll be fine, long as you keep to the main road. Town's quiet this time of week." Quiet. The word had comforted her then. By noon, she reached the edge of Dry Hollow, a small town built from dust and stubborn hope. The air shimmered above the roofs, and somewhere, a piano played faintly inside the saloon, a melody slow and hollow as memory. She hitched the mules outside the general store and stepped down, brushing her skirt. Inside, it was cool and dim. The shopkeeper, an older man with kind eyes, greeted her with a nod. "Afternoon, ma'am. Needin' supplies?" "Yes, sir," she said softly. "Just flour, soap, and some salt, if you have it." He smiled. Plenty of all 3. As he packed her order, she wandered toward the shelves, fingertips grazing the sacks of grain, the rows of lantern oil. The normalcy of it, the simple hum of life, steadied her. For the first time in years, she almost felt like any other woman on an ordinary errand. Then she heard it a laugh, low, sharp, familiar in the worst way. She froze. The sound came from the back of the store, near the crates of tobacco. Her hand tightened around the counter. A man stepped into view, tall, broad, wearing a hat too fine for the place. His beard was flecked with gray now, but the eyes, those eyes she would have known anywhere. "Clara," he drawled, voice like smoke. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't think ghosts did their own shopping." The world tilted. Her breath caught. She couldn't move, couldn't even speak. His name lodged like a thorn in her throat. Royce Harlan, the man who'd once set fire to everything she'd loved. The man who'd dragged her from her home, mocking her mother's prayers as flames swallowed the roof. He took a step closer, grinning. "You look better fed these days. Your new man treating you nice, or he just bought himself a wife like everyone says." The words hit harder than a slap. The room blurred walls, shelves, light all folding inward until there was only his voice. Cruel and lazy. She stumbled back, shaking her head. "Don't," he laughed. "Don't what? Speak the truth." But before he could step closer, the shopkeeper's voice cut in. Firm. "That's enough. Harlan, leave the lady be." Royce tilted his hat. "Ain't your business, old man. It is in my store," came the steady reply. For one long moment, the air crackled with the memory of old violence. Then Royce smirked, spat on the floor, and walked out into the blinding sunlight. Clara stood frozen, the sound of his boots fading like the echo of a nightmare. "You all right, ma'am?" the shopkeeper asked softly. She nodded, though she wasn't. "Yes, I need to go." He didn't press her, just wrapped her parcels carefully, set them in her hands, and said, "Ride home safe now." She barely remembered the road back, only the wind whipping her tears, the mule's hooves pounding the dirt, the dry taste of fear on her tongue. Every mile felt heavier, the memory pressing in from all sides. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun was already sinking. She didn't stop to unhitch the wagon, just climbed down, stumbled inside, and shut the door behind her. The walls that had felt like safety now felt too small. She sank to the floor, her breath coming fast, her body trembling as if the fire had found her again. Hours passed. The light faded. When Elias returned, the yard was dark. He noticed the wagon still hitched, the mules restless. His stomach knotted. He opened the door softly. The lamp still burned low, and there she was sitting by the hearth, her face pale, eyes distant. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't need to. He recognized the look, the kind that comes when the past reaches out and grabs hold of you by the throat. He simply said, "You eat anything." She shook her head. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll fix something." He moved through the room with the calm of a man who understood the power of silence. A few minutes later, he set a tray on the small table stew, bread, and tea. He didn't tell her to eat. He just left it there, then walked to the door. "I'll be outside a while," he said. She looked up. Elias. But he was already putting on his coat, stepping out into the night. Clara sat in the dim light, watching the shadows move across the floor. When she finally rose, she saw him through the window sitting on the porch, rifle resting beside him, lantern glowing at his feet. He wasn't pacing, wasn't restless, just there, watching, waiting, guarding. She pressed her hand against the glass. He hadn't asked her a single question, hadn't demanded an explanation. He'd simply made sure she wasn't alone. That night, for the first time since Missouri, Clara fell asleep without locking her door. When she woke near dawn, the first light spilling over the plains, Elias was still on the porch, hat pulled low, the rifle untouched. His eyes were heavy but calm. She stepped outside, the chill air brushing her cheeks. He looked up. "Mornin'," he said softly. "Mornin'." She echoed. He studied her face, saw the weariness there, and said only, "Whoever it was, he's gone now. You're here. That's what matters." Her throat tightened. "You're not going to ask." He shook his head. "When you're ready, you'll tell me. Until then, my job's just to keep the wolves away." Clara's eyes filled, not from fear this time, but from the strange, unbearable kindness of being believed without proof. She whispered, "Thank you." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture so small, yet so full, it broke her open. Inside, the morning light touched the daisies bloomin' by the porch wild, stubborn things that had taken root in hard soil and still dared to lift their faces toward the sun. And in that moment, Clara knew safety wasn't the absence of pain. It was the presence of someone who would stand between you and its return. The days after the encounter in Dry Hollow unfolded like pages in a book, left open beneath the sun, slow, unhurried, touched with quiet grace. For Clara Jennings, something inside her had shifted. The fear that once lived beneath her skin hadn't vanished. Fear never truly does, but it had softened, as though it now knew it was no longer the only thing keeping her alive. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Elias Boone splitting wood outside, the steady rhythm of his work a kind of heartbeat through the cabin walls. He never spoke of that night, never mentioned the shadow that had followed her home. Yet every evening, she found his rifle leaned by the porch, polished and ready, and every dawn, his boots by the door a quiet vow that he wasn't going anywhere. He didn't guard her with questions or pity. He guarded her with presence, and somehow that made all the difference. Clara began to move through her days with a steadier breath. She baked again, tending to the small garden they'd built together, and found herself humming as she worked a tune she hadn't remembered since childhood. The daisies by the fence had grown wild now, spilling across the yard like a patch of sunlight that refused to fade. Every time she passed them, she thought of her mother, of how kindness, once planted, could outlast even the hardest seasons. One evening, she found herself at the small writing desk Elias had built from leftover pine boards. It was simple, rough-edged, but it faced the window where the last light of day poured in. She opened her old leather-bound notebook, the one that had traveled with her from Missouri, its pages still carrying the faint scent of smoke. For months, she hadn't touched it. The words she'd once written of grief, loss, and running had felt like ashes in her hands. But now, her fingers moved, slowly at first, then with growing certainty. She wrote, "It has been many years since I trusted silence, but this place, this man has taught me that not all silence means danger. Some silences mean peace. Some mean safety." She paused, the pen trembling slightly between her fingers. Outside, the wind stirred the grass, and she could hear Elias hammering something in the barn, the steady rhythm that had come to anchor her days. She smiled faintly and kept writing. "I once thought strength meant never needing anyone, but I see now that real strength is gentler than that. It waits, it listens, it stands watch outside your door until the fear passes." When Elias came in later, his boots dusty, she quickly closed the notebook. He didn't ask what she'd been doing. He never did. He only nodded toward the stove. "Smells good in here," he said. "It's stew," she replied, a touch shy. "I thought you might be hungry." "I'm always hungry," he said, with a half-smile that still caught her off guard. They ate in the same quiet way they always did, the kind of quiet that felt full, not empty. And when their eyes met over the flicker of the lantern, Clara found herself smiling first. After supper, He took his coffee out to the porch while she washed the dishes. The evening light turned everything soft, the edges of the barn, the golden grass, even the lines of his face. When she joined him, he handed her a mug. "Peaceful out here tonight," he said. "It is," she murmured. "Feels different somehow." He looked at her, studying her face the way a man might study a horizon he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. Different, good, or different, bad. She thought for a moment. "Good," she said finally. "Different, good." He nodded, satisfied, and leaned back in his chair. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke. The world was quiet except for the wind and the faint cry of a coyote in the hills. For the first time since she'd come to this land, Clara wasn't listening for danger. She was listening for life. That night, she wrote again. "He doesn't ask where I go when I fall quiet. He just lets me return. Maybe love isn't something you find all at once. Maybe it's something that grows where the world finally feels safe enough to breathe." The next morning, she found a new bouquet of daisies on the porch rail, freshly cut, their stems wrapped in twine. No note, no explanation, just flowers, simple and pure. She smiled to herself, touching one petal. He must have risen before dawn to gather them. Later that day, as she hung laundry on the line, Elias passed by with a sack of feed over his shoulder. "You've been writing again," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara blinked, surprised. "How did you know?" He shrugged lightly. "You get quiet in a different way when you write. Not like you're hiding more, like you're listening." She felt a warmth bloom in her chest. "Maybe I am." He paused, setting the sack down. "That's good. Some things are worth listening to." Their eyes met, and for a moment the wind caught her hair, sending loose strands across her face. Without thinking, Elias reached out and brushed one away. His hand lingered just a moment too long, not in boldness, but in reverence, as if afraid the gesture itself might break something fragile. Neither spoke, but the silence between them, that old, trusted silence, said enough. That evening, Clara sat by the window again, watching the prairie fade into dusk. The lantern light flickered, soft and golden. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "I think I understand now why flowers bloom even in hard soil. They don't choose the ground they grow in, only how they face the sun. Maybe people are the same." She set down her pen and looked out toward the barn, where Elias was still working, the light of his lantern glowing steady against the dark. For the first time in years, she felt it not just safety, but belonging. Not just survival, but the first gentle stirrings of love. Autumn came slow to Willow Creek, brushing the land in gold and rust. The air turned crisp, the mornings edged with frost, and the prairie grass bent low beneath the weight of dew. The world, once wild and harsh, now seemed gentler, or perhaps it was Clara who had changed. Every season, she'd once believed, brought loss. Now, she began to wonder if it might also bring grace. Elias Boone had been working from sunrise to dusk, preparing the ranch for winter. She watched him from the window as he stacked hay bales, his movements sure and quiet. He didn't waste words or gestures. He simply did what needed doing, as though kindness itself were part of his daily labor. Sometimes, when she left fresh coffee by the barn, he'd give a brief nod, not as thanks, but as understanding. That was how they spoke now, through small things that meant more than most people's declarations. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Clara sat at her desk by lamplight. Her journal lay open, its pages soft from use. She had begun to write every night, not for anyone else to read, but for herself. Writing had become her quiet way of breathing. Tonight, she began a new entry. Today, I watched a man do something kind with no witness, no applause. He helped an old mare stand after she'd fallen in the mud. He spoke to her like she mattered, though no one was there to hear. And I thought this is what goodness is. It doesn't need to be seen. It just is. She paused, pen hovering, then continued. I used to believe love was something to fear, something that could be taken, twisted, or burned. But I see now that love, the real kind, doesn't demand anything. It simply stays quietly, like the sound of footsteps outside your door when the world feels too big. The words surprised her with their honesty. She sat back, reading them again, feeling something swell in her chest, not tears exactly, but the ache of recognition. Elias had never spoken of love. He didn't have to. He showed it in ways that left no room for doubt: a repaired fence before dawn, a warm meal left when she was too tired to cook, a presence that steadied every breath she took. Clara dipped her pen again. Maybe I'm not afraid to be loved anymore. Maybe I've stopped asking what I deserve and started believing in what I'm given. When she finished, she closed the notebook gently, tracing her initials on the cover. It was the first time in years that the word hope didn't feel like a stranger. Outside, the wind shifted. She heard Elias's boots on the porch, slow, even, deliberate. He came in, dusted with hay, the cold still clinging to his coat. "Evenin'," he said, hanging his hat. "Evenin'," she replied, smiling faintly. He looked tired but peaceful, the way men look when their work matches their soul. "Got all the cattle penned?" she asked. He nodded. "Took longer than I thought. One of the steers spooked the mare. She fell near the creek. Old bones, but she'll be fine." "I saw," Clara said softly, "from the window." Elias shrugged, almost embarrassed. "Couldn't leave her down. She's earned her keep." She studied him, the way his voice carried no pride, no need to explain, just quiet decency. Later, as they ate supper, the conversation drifted like the smoke from their lantern, easy, unhurried. Elias spoke of weather and fence posts, and Clara listened, her heart full with all the things he didn't say but somehow still meant. The next morning, when Elias rode into town to trade supplies, he stopped by the mercantile. Old Mr. Hanley, the storekeeper, was talking with another rancher, mentioning how Boone had stayed up half the night mending a neighbor's broken gate before the storm. Fella didn't even ask him to. Hanley said he had time, and that widow down the ridge didn't. When Elias heard that, he just smiled faintly. Wasn't nothing. He said gate needed fixin'. That's all. He paid for his grain and left without another word. By afternoon, word of his quiet help had reached Clara. The widow herself had stopped by, leaving a small jar of preserves as thanks. He said he had time, the woman told her, and I didn't have anyone else. When the wagon disappeared down the trail, Clara stood holding that jar, her throat tight. That night, she opened her journal again, unable to stop herself. The page before her was already full of yesterday's reflections, but she needed to add more. "He doesn't see what he is." She wrote, "He moves through the world like his kindness is nothing more than breathing. I don't think he knows how much light he carries." She hesitated, then added one final line, "If love is measured not by words, but by quiet deeds, then I think I've already found mine." As the ink dried, she closed the book and sat back, the firelight flickering across her face. She didn't know that, later that week, while cleaning, she would leave the journal open on the table and Elias, coming in from the cold, would glance down and see only one line: "I didn't marry him because I needed him, but because I needed to escape." He wouldn't see the rest, not the words that came after, not the truth that turned fear into love. For now, though, all was still. The lamp burned low, and outside the wind sang through the willows a soft, forgiving song. Clara laid her head against the window pane and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me stay." And though no one heard it, she swore the land itself seemed to answer. The wind had turned colder in Willow Creek. By late October, frost clung to the grass each morning, and the sky stretched wide and pale, a canvas of coming winter. The rhythm of the ranch slowed, the cattle moved less. The days grew shorter, and silence filled the spaces between. One evening, while the last of the sun bled across the horizon, Elias Boone returned from the pasture earlier than usual. His hands were numb from the cold, his shoulders stiff with the weight of the day. Inside, the cabin glowed warm lamplight, firelight, and the quiet scent of stew simmering on the stove. He smiled faintly, the way he always did when he came home to that glow. "Clara," he called softly, setting his gloves on the table. Her voice drifted from the back room. "I'll be right out." Elias moved to hang his coat, but his eyes caught on something lying open on the desk near the window, her leather-bound journal. It rested where she'd left it, a page half turned, the ink still dark. He hesitated. He wasn't a man who pried, but something about the page, the way it fluttered in the draft, drew his gaze. He meant only to close it, to protect it from the wind. But his eyes caught a few words, just a few. "I didn't marry him because I needed him, but because I needed to escape." The world seemed to still. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The words pressed into him like the edge of a blade, quiet, clean, certain. He read no further. He didn't see the next line that followed, didn't see the truth she had written after, the confession that changed everything. All he saw was that one line. Elias closed the book gently, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. Then he stood there, staring out the window as the light faded from gold to blue. When Clara stepped into the room, wiping her hands on her apron, she saw him standing by the desk still, silent. "You're home early," she said softly, smiling. He turned, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before: distance. Not anger, not accusation, just a kind of quiet ache. "Long day?" she asked carefully. He nodded once, "Reckon so." She stepped closer. "You should eat. I kept the stew warm." He looked at her then, his voice rough. "You don't owe me that." The words caught her off guard. What do you mean?" He shook his head. "I mean, you don't have to keep pretending." "Clara, you did what you had to do. Came out here to start over. That's all right." Her heart began to pound. "Elias, what are you talking about?" But he was already moving toward the door, reaching for his hat. "I'll eat later. The horses need checking. Elias." He paused, one hand on the latch. "It's fine. Really, you don't have to explain." Then he was gone, the cold air rushing in behind him. Clara stood there for a long moment, frozen. Then her gaze fell on the desk of the open journal. The page turned. She moved toward it slowly, her breath shallow. When she saw which page he'd read, Her knees nearly gave way. "Oh, no," she whispered. Her hand covered her mouth. She read the line, the one he must have seen, and then the next, the words that had been meant to heal the first. "But now I see him, and I'm afraid he'll stop waiting for me." Tears burned her eyes. She sank into the chair, pressing her palms against the table. "Oh, Elias." Outside, the wind had picked up, whispering against the windows. She sat there listening, every heartbeat heavy with what had been lost, not through cruelty, but through the small, sharp pain of being misunderstood. That night, Elias didn't come back inside. Clara watched from the window as he paced the yard once, then sat by the barn with the lantern burning low. The cold wrapped around him, but he didn't seem to notice. He'd spent most of his life believing silence was the kindest thing a man could offer. Now, that same silence felt like a wall. Inside, Clara opened her journal again. The ink blurred through her tears as she wrote. He read the words, but not the meaning. And I can't blame him. I wrote them from fear not of him, but of what it means to be seen. I ran from pain so long I forgot what peace looked like when it came. And now, I fear I've made him think he was only a refuge. She paused, then wrote one more line. If he walks away, I will understand. But God, please, let him know I see him, truly see him before he does. Outside, the night deepened. A lone coyote called somewhere across the valley, and the sound cut through the dark like a question left unanswered. In the early hours before dawn, Clara finally stepped outside. The air was bitter, sharp enough to sting her lungs. She found Elias sitting by the fence, hat pulled low, his coat dusted with frost. "You'll freeze out here," she said softly. He didn't look up. "I've been colder." She came closer, her hands trembling slightly. "You read my journal." He flinched, just barely. Didn't mean to. Wind caught it open. Saw a line I shouldn't have. I know which one. He nodded. "Don't matter. I get it. You needed to leave where you were. I was just where you ended up." "No," she said, her voice shaken. "You stopped reading too soon." He frowned. She knelt in front of him then, her breath misting in the cold. The next line, "Elias," it said, "but now I see him, and I'm afraid he'll stop waiting for me. You were never my escape. You were my home." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the dry grass. Elias's eyes closed, his shoulders sinking. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full of everything they hadn't said. Finally, he exhaled. "Guess I should have known you'd write better than I read." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she laughed a fragile, trembling sound that felt like forgiveness. He reached for her hand, rough and warm, and she didn't pull away. The first light of morning crept over the horizon, painting the fields in silver. They sat there together until the frost began to melt. Their hands still clasped not as apology, but as promise. Winter had not yet come to Willow Creek, but the air already carried its chill, the kind that made the sky brittle and the earth dry enough to whisper danger. For weeks, Clara Jennings and Elias Boone had lived in quiet understanding. Their words fewer, but their hearts nearer. The misunderstanding between them had passed like a small storm, painful, but leaving behind clearer skies. They spoke gently now, as if both knew how easily peace could be lost. That morning had been bright and windless. By evening, the wind had turned fierce, restless, and full of dust. Elias noticed it first. out by the west pasture. A strange smell, sharp and bitter, carried through the air. Smoke. He turned toward the ridge and saw it a dark plume rising against the dying light. "Fire," he shouted, running toward the barn. Clara. She came out onto the porch, eyes wide. Where North Ridge? If the wind shifts, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. The wind was already turning. They worked fast. Elias unhitched the horses, drove the cattle down toward the creek bed. Clara filled buckets from the pump, her hands shaking as she passed them. The air grew thicker by the minute, smoke rolling low, red light flickering through it like breath. By the time the first embers drifted down across the yard, the world had gone red and gold. "Get inside," Elias shouted, coughing. "I'm not leaving you, Clara. Go." But she didn't move. She saw the flames catching in the dry grass near the barn, saw Elias grab a blanket and rush toward them. His figure vanished into the smoke. "Elias," she cried. There was no answer, only the roar of fire. She ran after him, the heat searing her face, the smell of burning hay choking her lungs. Through the haze, she saw him near the stalls, trying to free the last horse, the old mare he'd rescued months before. The animal kicked and screamed, trapped by a fallen beam. Elias threw his shoulder against it, the flames licking at his sleeve. He managed to pull the beam aside, and the mare bolted free, but the beam caught him as it fell, scraping across his arm, tearing through cloth and skin. Elias' Clara reached him, coughing hard, the smoke thick around them. "You have to get out." He shook his head. "Get the ledger. What, my notebook? By the window, the one with the blue cover." She stared at him, disbelief cutting through her fear. "That's what you're thinking about now." He didn't answer. He just looked at her, that quiet, steady look she knew too well, and said, "Please." Clara turned and ran. Inside the house, smoke was already seeping through the walls. The air shimmered with heat. She found the ledger on the shelf by the window, leather-bound, worn at the edges, tied with a frayed cord. She grabbed it, clutching it to her chest. Then she hesitated. On the desk beside it lay her own journal, the one that had once broken him. She picked it up too. Outside, the sky glowed orange. She stumbled back through the yard, calling his name. Elias, he was near the fence, helping the last of the horses through the gate. His shirt sleeve was burned, his skin raw, but he was still moving, still fighting. When she reached him, she pressed the ledger against his chest. "I couldn't let it burn," she said, breathless. "It's you." He stared at her, soot streaked across her face, eyes wet and shining. For a long moment, neither spoke. The firelight danced between them, fierce and alive. Then he reached for her, pulling her close. "You're out of your mind," he whispered. "So are you," she said, half laughing, half crying. He held her there as the wind howled around them, the fire finally beginning to fade where the ground turned to wet clay near the creek. The night sky above was a haze of stars and smoke, the air thick with the smell of ash and rain. When it was over, the barn was half gone, the fences blackened, but the house still stood. Somehow, it had been spared. They sat together on the porch steps, wrapped in blankets, the fire's glow still flickering on the horizon. Elias's arm was bandaged now, his skin blistered but healing. Clara leaned against his shoulder, the ledger still resting on her lap. He glanced down at it. "You shouldn't have gone back for that." She shook her head. "You don't understand. It wasn't just a book. It's every word you never said, every piece of you you kept hidden." Elias looked at her, something raw and tender in his eyes, and yours. She held up her journal, the one she'd grabbed second. "This one's mine. I guess I didn't want to lose my words either." He smiled faintly. "Seems we both got something worth saving." They sat in silence then, the sound of the creek nearby, the faint hiss of dying embers. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elias, when I ran into that fire, I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of losing you before I ever told you how I felt." He turned toward her, his face soft in the moonlight. "You just did," he said. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then don't make me say it again." He brushed a thumb across her face, gentle as breath. "Wouldn't dream of it." The stars burned low above them, the prairie hushed and still. In that quiet, scarred land, love had finally found its voice, not in grand speeches or promises, but in the shared act of saving what mattered most. They stayed there until dawn, the ashes cooling around them, the first light of morning breaking through the smoke. The world looked fragile and new, as if it, too, had survived something sacred. The morning after the fire. Willow Creek lay hushed beneath a veil of ash. The sky was pale, the air faintly sweet with the scent of smoke and wet earth. It was as if the world itself was catching its breath. The barn had fallen. The fences were blackened, the fields scarred. But the house, their home, still stood, its whitewashed walls smudged with soot but unbroken. Clara Jennings sat on the porch steps, wrapped in Elias's coat. Her hair was damp with dew, her fingers trembling slightly around the tin cup of coffee he'd brought her. The land before them stretched quiet and gray, the kind of silence that followed both destruction and deliverance. Elias Boone sat beside her, his arm bandaged and resting across his lap. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed, but there was something peaceful there, too, a calm earned, not given. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. When Clara finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's strange," she said, "how something so fierce could leave behind so much stillness." Elias nodded. "Fire takes what it wants, but it also gives back what you never knew you had." She looked at him then, really looked at the soot on his neck, the raw scrape on his jaw, the quiet way he stared at the land like it still belonged to him. No matter how it had changed, he had almost died saving what little they had, and she had risked everything to save what couldn't be replaced, the words that had kept him human. That thought made her chest tighten. "I used to think survival meant keeping everything safe," she said softly. "Now, I think it means learning what you can let burn." Elias turned toward her, brow furrowed just slightly. "And what can't you?" he asked. She met his gaze. "You?" For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still again, the wind, the birds, even the soft crackle of the last embers. Elias's throat worked, but no words came. Instead, he reached over, his hand covering hers, rough and warm. "You're something else." "Clara Jennings," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "So are you, Elias Boone." They sat like that for a while, hand in hand, watching as the wind carried thin trails of smoke toward the horizon. The light shifted slowly from gray to gold, from gold to pale blue, as the day began its long, forgiving stretch forward. Later, when the neighbors arrived to help, bringing water and tools and whatever they could spare, Elias thanked them in that quiet, sincere way of his. Clara moved among them, offering bread, bandages, and gentle words. The kindness of others wrapped around their little homestead like a patchwork quilt. By evening, the porch was swept, the house cleaned, the last embers buried deep in the earth, and though the barn still stood in ruins, the ranch, their life, somehow felt more alive than before. That night, under a sky washed clean of smoke, Elias found Clara sitting on the porch again. She was barefoot, her journal open on her knees. The firelight from the house flickered across her face. He stepped quietly beside her. Writing again, she looked up, smiling softly, trying to, but the words feel small tonight. He sat beside her, resting his hat on his knee. Small's all right. Sometimes the biggest things don't need big words. She turned a page, and the sound of paper in the quiet air felt like a prayer. After a long pause, she said, "Do you ever think about before?" Before all this, Elias leaned back against the post, eyes on the stars, every day, but it don't hurt the same way anymore. What changed? He looked at her then, his expression thoughtful, gentle. Guess I stopped seeing the past as something that took from me and started seeing it as what led me here. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. To me, to us, he said, to now. The night air carried the faint scent of char and sage. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, its lonely cry rising and falling like a song. Clara closed her journal, setting it gently beside her. Elias. I think I finally understand what my mother meant when she said love doesn't always come with fireworks or music. Sometimes it just comes and stays. He smiled faintly. Reckon she was right. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Then, I think it's here to stay. He didn't answer, but his hand found hers again. Fingers intertwining no grand promise, just the quiet certainty of shared breath. The moon climbed higher, silvering the burned fields. In the pale light, even the ruins seemed softer, almost beautiful, as if the land itself was forgiving. For a long time, they sat there, saying nothing. The silence between them was no longer fragile, it was full of everything they'd endured and everything they still hoped for. At last, Elias said, almost to himself, "Funny thing about fire. Folks say it destroys, but truth is, sometimes it just clears the ground so something better can grow." Clara smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks again, not from sorrow this time, but from something deeper, purer. "Then I suppose," she whispered, "we're what grew." He looked at her, and the faintest, most honest smile touched his face. "Yeah, guess we are." They stayed until dawn again, until the light turned soft and warm and the land began to breathe anew. Birds returned, calling from the cottonwoods. A thin mist rose from the creek, silver against the morning, and there, on that porch surrounded by ash and hope, two weary souls, once strangers, once broken, found peace not in what they had built, but in what they had survived together. Spring came quietly to Willow Creek that year, the kind of spring that doesn't announce itself with thunder or bloom, but with small, stubborn signs of life, a green shoot pushing through black soil. The return of a meadowlark's song, the sound of the creek, full again after months of silence. The land was healing. So were they. The willow by the water, the same one that had burned in the fire, stood bare but alive. Its blackened trunk split open to reveal a thin line of pale new wood. Clara would walk there each morning, touching the bark as if in greeting. "You're still here," she would whisper. And every time she said it, Part of her meant the tree. The other part meant herself. Elias Boone had thrown himself into rebuilding the barn, not because the work demanded it, but because his hands didn't know how to be still. When she brought him water, he'd smile that quiet smile of his half gratitude, half disbelief that she was still by his side. One afternoon, she found him sitting under the willow, knife in hand, whittling something small and deliberate. Wood shavings curled around his boots, catching the sunlight like curls of gold. He didn't look up as she approached. "You'll carve through that log if you're not careful," she teased gently. "It ain't a log," he said. "It's a piece of the willow." She knelt beside him, curiosity soft in her voice. From when it burned, he nodded. Didn't have the heart to throw it out. Figured if it could still hold together after all that, maybe it deserved another chance. She smiled. "Sounds like someone I know." He glanced up then, eyes meeting hers, steady and blue as the Wyoming sky. Days passed like that work. Quiet laughter, the rhythm of a life slowly finding its way back. The scars on the land grew smaller with each sunrise, the wounds on their hearts gentler with each shared silence. Then, one evening in late April, when the air smelled of new grass and rain, Elias asked her to walk with him down by the creek. She followed, her skirt brushing through the fresh shoots of clover, her heart strangely restless. The willow stood waiting green again, impossibly alive. Tiny leaves shimmered at the ends of its branches, tender as breath. Elias stopped beneath it and turned to her. In his hand was the small thing he'd been carving. It was a ring, not gold, not silver, but wood, smooth and warm, shaped from the heart of the willow's burned branch. He held it out to her, his voice low, roughened by both wind and feeling. "This tree shouldn't be here," he said. "Fire should have taken it clean, but look at it now." She did. The branches trembled lightly in the breeze, alive with green. "If it can grow again," he continued, "then I reckon we can too. What burned us didn't end us." Clara. It made room for something stronger. Her eyes filled before she could speak. The light caught the edges of his hair, the soft curve of his scar, the steady hope that had carried them through so much. He took her hand, slipping the ring over her finger. The wood fit warm against her skin. "I ain't got much to offer," he said quietly. "No fine gold, no promises of ease, but I've got a heart that's still learning how to stay, and I'd like it to stay with you." Clara's throat tightened. Words seemed too small, too fragile for what she felt, so she simply nodded, her hand trembling in his. "Yes," she whispered. Elias let out a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as the wind rose, rustling through the new leaves above. The willow bent slightly, as if bowing and blessing. They stood there, two figures against the dusk, the light fading into that soft, endless blue that belongs only to the plains. There was no music, only the whisper of wind through branches, the low hum of the creek, and the rhythm of two hearts finally at peace, beating in time. Later, as they sat beneath the willow, the world quiet around them, Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "Elias," she murmured, "do you ever think we'd have found each other without all the pain?" He was silent a moment, then shook his head. "Pain's just the road, Clara. Love's what makes the travel worth it." She smiled, closing her eyes. "Then I'm glad I walked it." He kissed her hair slow, reverent, and together they watched the stars begin to appear, one by one. Years later, folks in Willow Creek would tell stories about that spring, how the grass came back greener than anyone remembered, how the willow grew stronger each year until its branches reached the water again. Some said the land itself had been blessed by what those two souls had endured, and sometimes, on still evenings, travelers passing through could swear they saw them an old couple sitting hand in hand beneath the great willow, their laughter carried softly on the wind. But for Clara and Elias, it wasn't legend, it was life, a quiet, ordinary, holy life built from ashes, kept alive by grace. Sometimes the hardest roads lead us right where we belong. In the story of the mail order bride and the cowboy, we've walked beside two people who carried more scars than hope, Clara Jennings and Elias Boone, and watched as fear slowly gave way to faith and loneliness to love. Their journey reminds us that healing rarely comes all at once. It arrives quietly in the small acts of kindness, in the way someone stays when they could have walked away, in the courage to believe that something broken can still bloom again. Out on the frontier, the land taught people to endure, to rebuild after every fire, to plant again after every storm. And maybe that's what love is too, not a grand rescue, but the steady work of two hearts choosing each other again and again, even when the world turns cold. So, wherever you are tonight, may you remember this: your story isn't over just because it's been hard. Like the willow that grew from ashes, you, too, can begin again. Thank you, friends, for riding with us through this tale of grace and redemption. If it touched your heart, if you found a bit of yourself in Clara or Elias, we'd be truly grateful if you'd like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. Every story here is a small prayer for courage, for compassion, and for the kind of love that endures the frontier within us all.